My name is Lena Porter and I'm 36 years old. I had spent weeks, no, months, preparing for this day, this evening, this very moment. The snow had just started to fall that morning, light and soft, settling on the bare branches and rooftops of the quiet town. It was the kind of snow that made you believe just for a second that magic could be real, that maybe this year would be different. I clung to that hope as I walked up the steps to my brother Zachary's house, carrying a large, carefully wrapped box in my arms. The wrapping paper was ivory white with gold stars delicately scattered across it, and I'd tied it with a velvet ribbon the color of deep winter berries. I had spent hours getting it just right. Every corner sharp, every fold neat. It wasn't just a gift, it was a message. An offering. Something to say, see me, acknowledge me, let me belong. I had spent so long imagining how it would feel when I finally handed it over, when their faces would light up, when they'd understand how much I cared. Maybe they'd even apologize, softly, clumsily, for all the years they made me feel like I didn't quite fit. As I stepped inside, the warmth of the house hit me, scented with pine, cinnamon, roasted meats, and the low hum of classic holiday music playing in the background. The room was filled with the glow of fairy lights, golden and soft, casting shadows on faces I knew too well. Laughter echoed from the kitchen and the sound of clinking glasses followed, as if the entire house exhaled joy and nostalgia. Then I heard his voice. "Children don't belong here," Zachary said, loud enough for everyone to hear. He was holding a glass of red wine, one arm casually slung over the back of the couch. His smile didn't reach his eyes, and when he looked at me, it was the same look he'd given me since we were kids. Half amused, half dismissive, like I was a game he'd outgrown. His words didn't need context. Everyone in the room knew who he meant. He didn't look at my package or at me, just took a sip of his wine and laughed with someone beside him. The room fell quiet for a moment, a pause in conversation, a ripple of discomfort that passed over everyone like a shadow. My mother, who had been setting out silverware at the dining table, looked up, her hands frozen mid-motion. Our eyes met for a fraction of a second. I waited for her to say something, to clear her throat, to change the subject, to correct him. Anything. But she just blinked and turned away, smoothing out a crease in the tablecloth as if that required all her attention. No one else said anything either. Not my sister-in-law, who barely looked at me except to offer a forced smile. Not my cousin Rachel, who used to braid my hair when we were little. Not even my father, who was halfway through a scotch, staring into the fire like it might answer a question he didn't want to ask aloud. I stood there, still holding the gift, its weight suddenly unbearable. My fingers had gone cold despite my gloves. I could feel my heart pounding in my ears, not from rage, but from the familiar ache of being unwanted in a space that was supposed to feel like home. I hadn't even taken off my coat yet. I wanted to say something, anything. A sharp comeback. A bitter joke. Even just a simple hello, to force them to acknowledge me as more than just an interruption. But the words sat heavy in my throat like ice. Instead, I stepped further into the room, the sound of my boots on the hardwood floor muffled by the thick rug beneath me. I moved to the corner where they kept the gifts, near the tree, and placed mine gently among them. It stood out, larger, more carefully wrapped than the rest. It looked like it didn't belong, just like me. I took off my coat slowly, hanging it on the same hook I'd used since childhood. The hook still wobbled, still hung lower than the others. Dad had promised to fix it once when I was 11. The rest of the evening moved around me like a movie I wasn't part of. Conversations layered over each other. About jobs, children, vacation plans. Laughter erupted in waves, none of it meant for me. I smiled when someone caught my eye, nodded when spoken to, but no one really spoke to me. No one asked about my work or my apartment, or how I'd been holding up after the breakup. It was as if I had walked into a party hosted by strangers who happened to have my last name. At dinner, I was placed at the far end of the table between the coat closet and the window. A draft came in through the old frame, making the back of my neck cold. The others were bunched closer together like a warm center I hadn't been invited into. The food was good, ham with honey glaze, mashed potatoes so smooth they melted on the tongue, spiced carrots roasted to caramel perfection, but everything tasted like ash. I chewed and swallowed, smiled when expected, filled my glass with wine and sipped it slowly. No one asked who the gift was for. No one opened it. It sat there under the tree, pristine and unopened, a symbol of something I still hadn't figured out how to let go of. When the evening began to wind down, coats were pulled from hooks, children bundled in scarves, and hugs exchanged at the door. I stood quietly, waiting for the right moment to slip out without drawing attention. As I reached for my own coat, I saw my brother glance at the tree. "You forgot your present," he said. I turned to look at him. "It's not for me." He raised an eyebrow. "Well, nobody else claimed it." I wanted to say that it wasn't about claiming, that it was about trying, that maybe I wasn't supposed to keep trying. But instead I said nothing. I just nodded, pulled on my gloves and stepped out into the cold. The snow had picked up, falling thicker now, coating everything in clean, soft white. I walked to my car in silence, my breath rising in clouds before me. As I opened the door, I looked back once more at the house. Warm, golden, full of people who didn't see me. Then I drove away. As everyone began to gather around the long dining table, laughter echoing off the walls and silverware clinking gently as places were taken, I slowly made my way toward the center of the room, carrying a glass of white wine I no longer had the appetite for. The table was beautifully set, white linen, shimmering chargers, candles flickering in tall brass holders. The place cards were elegant, each name written in neat cursive on thick ivory stock tucked into tiny wreaths of holly and rosemary. I scanned them carefully as I walked past. Zachary, Haley, Bryce, Mom, Dad, Rachel, even Rachel's boyfriend whose name I always forgot. But not mine. Not anywhere. I checked again. Once. Twice. I told myself maybe it was a mistake, an oversight, that someone had simply forgotten to place my card. But deep down I knew it wasn't a mistake. It was a message. A quiet, pointed erasure of my presence. I swallowed hard and let my fingers brush the back of an empty chair, one labeled for Haley's cousin who didn't even show up. I waited, standing awkwardly, hoping someone would notice, would say something, would offer a seat. But nothing. They were all too busy adjusting their napkins, sipping wine, laughing about stories from holidays past. Just as I was about to step back from the table, Zachary looked up from his seat at the head. Of course, he always sat at the head, and waved a hand without even looking directly at me. "Grab a chair from the kitchen," he said casually, as if he were talking to a server. Not even a glance in my direction. Just a flick of his wrist and a dismissive tone, like I was in the way, like he was doing me a favor by letting me stay at all. I stood there for a second, wine glass trembling slightly in my hand, and felt the heat rising up my neck. Haley, who was seated beside him in a soft gray cashmere sweater and gold earrings that caught the candlelight, didn't even look at me. She was smiling politely at something someone across from her had said, gently slicing her roast potatoes as though I weren't standing there like an unwanted guest at my own family's table. Her hand rested lightly on Zachary's forearm, her nails painted the same pale pink as the rose she drank. She didn't move, didn't speak, didn't acknowledge me. I turned and walked quietly back toward the kitchen, my boots making dull sounds against the wood floors. The kitchen was mostly empty, save for a few empty wine bottles by the sink and the smell of roasted meat still lingering in the air. I opened the pantry door and found the old folding chair. Metal, worn at the edges, the seat a little dented from years of use. It was the chair we used for kids' tables, for holiday overflow, for guests who didn't really matter. I carried it back to the dining room in silence, weaving between people who barely noticed I was there, and slid it into a small space between two chairs already occupied by distant relatives I hardly knew. No one shifted to make more room. I sat down, the chair creaking slightly beneath me, the metal legs wobbling a little on the uneven rug. My knees bumped the underside of the table, and the edge of the tablecloth brushed against my legs like a curtain meant to conceal something. To my left was a woman whose name escaped me, maybe a friend of Rachel's or someone from Haley's side. She was talking animatedly about a recent trip to Napa Valley, her voice bright, her teeth too white. To my right was an older man I didn't recognize at all, focused entirely on slicing his turkey with surgical precision. Neither of them looked at me. Bryce was across the table, barely present, his face lit by the glow of his phone screen. He didn't look up once, not even when his mother called his name to ask if he wanted more cranberry sauce. He just grunted and nodded, his thumbs tapping rapidly against the screen, completely absorbed in whatever teenage world he was inhabiting. I watched him for a moment, remembering when he was 5 and used to run up to me screaming, "Auntie Lena," like I was his favorite person in the world. Now he didn't even acknowledge me. No one passed me the bread. No one asked if I had enough to eat. When the gravy came around, it skipped me twice before I finally reached across awkwardly and took it myself. I tried to focus on my plate, to make the food taste like something, to anchor myself in the rhythm of chewing and swallowing. But it was hard to ignore the hum of conversation I wasn't part of, the jokes that didn't land near me, the memories shared in a circle that had long since closed itself off to me. Kept my face calm. Neutral. I told myself it didn't matter. That I was just here for the tradition, that this wasn't about me. But the truth pressed against my chest like something too heavy to carry. I had paid for the turkey. I had ordered the wines, chosen the labels, had them delivered with gift notes that said "From Lena, with love." I had picked out the garlands that wrapped around the banister, the ones now catching the glow from the fairy lights. I had done all of it. Quietly. Behind the scenes. Not for praise, though maybe part of me had hoped for it, but for the family. For us. And still I wasn't given a seat. Not really. As I stared at my plate, at the cranberry sauce bleeding into the stuffing, I felt a deep cold settle into my bones. The kind that has nothing to do with the winter outside. I looked up once more at the people around me, laughing, drinking, leaning into one another like branches on the same tree, and I realized with a clarity that hurt more than I was prepared for, that there was no room for me here. Not at this table. Not in the stories. Not in the structure of the family as it existed now. I lowered my gaze again, pressing my fingers into my napkin on my lap just to feel something solid. And I ate. Quietly. Without speaking. Without being spoken to. Because that was my place. The one I had to bring myself to. The one that no one thought to offer. The laughter grew louder around the table, blooming in waves of polished amusement that echoed off the crystal glasses and polished cutlery. Zachary was in the middle of one of his stories, a practiced monologue about his latest business deal, full of exaggerated charm and easy confidence. He spoke with that particular tone he reserved for being admired, lightly theatrical, full of rehearsed humility that only made people lean in closer. He was talking about a recent partnership with some mid-level investor from Boston, making it sound like he'd pulled off a minor miracle. Everyone at the table listened as if they were hanging on the words of a prophet. Haley laughed the loudest, tossing her head back like she was auditioning for a commercial. Even Rachel looked impressed, nodding along like Zachary had cured disease, not just closed another deal on an app that tracked meal plans for overworked executives. My mother beamed with quiet pride, her hands folded neatly on her lap as if she were watching a son receive an award, not just bragging over turkey and wine. I sat in my cold metal chair, still wedged between two people I barely knew, with my fork resting awkwardly across the edge of my plate. I had barely touched my food. The sound of Zachary's voice was beginning to grate, not because he was lying, he was telling the truth, but because I knew exactly what deal he was talking about. I knew it down to the spreadsheet columns and wire transfer receipts. I had funded it. Me. $450,000. Every cent of it had come from me. Quietly. Without conditions. Without drama. He came to me late one night last spring, nervous and uncharacteristically vulnerable, pacing in my small living room with a business plan in one hand and a tremble in the other. He'd said, "Lena, this is the one. I can feel it. But the banks won't take me seriously without someone backing me. I just need someone to believe in it. Just this once." I had hesitated. Not because I didn't believe in him, I always had more than I ever admitted, but because I knew what it meant. I knew that if I gave him that money, it wouldn't be remembered as a sacrifice. It wouldn't even be acknowledged. It would be absorbed into the narrative of Zachary's success like it had been his all along. But I gave it anyway. I wired it the next day with nothing more than a simple signed agreement and a quiet hope that this time finally, it would mean something. That when the moment came when the venture took off he would tell them. That he would look at me across the room, nod and say, "I couldn't have done this without Lena." He hadn't. Not then. Not now. As the laughter swelled again at some clever punchline I hadn't caught, I took a small sip of wine and leaned in slightly. Just enough to be part of the circle. I cleared my throat gently and said, "Actually, I've been working on something interesting too. My firm just wrapped up a project with." But before I could finish, someone, Rachel's boyfriend I think, jumped in with a louder voice saying, "Wait, Zach, didn't you say that guy from San Francisco wanted to license your platform?" And just like that, the attention shifted again, the table spun back toward him like a compass to the north. My sentence hung unfinished in the air for a moment before dissolving into nothing. I sat back. Silent. It wasn't the first time that night. Not the first time this year. Not the first time in my life. Every time I opened my mouth to share something real, something meaningful, something I had worked for, someone else spoke over me. Not maliciously. Not intentionally. Just effortlessly. As though it were natural to them that what I had to say didn't carry the same weight. I wasn't interesting. I wasn't dynamic. I was just Lena. The quiet one. The one who helps. The one who has a good job but doesn't talk about it much. The one who gets remembered when someone needs a ride, a loan, a second chance, but not when the wine is poured and the toasts begin. I stared down at my hands. My nails were clean, short, painted with a neutral polish. I had chosen this dress, charcoal gray silk, because I thought it looked elegant but understated, like someone who belonged in a room of grown-ups. I had curled my hair, worn the earrings Mom once said suited my face, spent the afternoon perfecting the makeup that now felt wasted. I had done everything right. Still invisible. Still a child in their eyes. Or worse, a bank account with legs. I wanted to stand up and scream. To push the chair back, to reach under the tree and throw the gift I had so carefully chosen into Zachary's lap and yell, "You want to talk about your deal? I was your deal." But I didn't. Of course I didn't. That would only confirm what they already seemed to believe about me. That I was too emotional, too sensitive, too much. Instead, I folded my hands again, pressing the pad of my thumb against my palm until it hurt. I kept my face neutral, nodded at the next round of laughter, and smiled when Haley looked briefly in my direction before turning back to her wine. Inside, I was folding in on myself, shrinking smaller with every breath. They didn't know. They didn't want to know. Not about the hours I worked, not about the money I had lent, not about the way I held this family up in ways they never saw. And maybe they never would. Maybe I was just background to them. A fixture. Someone always there, never counted. The worst part wasn't even the silence. It was the effort. The exhausting, endless effort of showing up again and again with full hands and an open heart, hoping this time would be different. That this time they would look up and really see me. But they didn't. They only saw each other. And Zachary, always Zachary, shining at the center of a universe they had all agreed to orbit. It was in the smallest moments that the truth became impossible to ignore. Not in the loud declarations or the absence of words, but in the way Haley handed the bottle of wine across the table, her manicured hand extending just far enough to pass it to Rachel, skipping over me without even a glance, though I was directly between them. Not even a flicker of acknowledgement, as though I were nothing more than the chair I sat on. I had reached out instinctively, thinking she meant to offer it to me, but my hand froze midair when I realized she wasn't even looking in my direction. She hadn't considered me. I wasn't part of the exchange. I withdrew my hand and placed it gently on my lap, curling my fingers into my dress fabric to keep them from shaking. The bottle passed over me and so did the conversation. Every thread of connection at that table flowed in one direction, weaving tightly around itself like a net I hadn't been invited into. And I realized with a sharp, hollow certainty that this wasn't new. This wasn't a slip or a one-time misstep. This was their pattern. This was the way they had learned to treat me. Like I was peripheral. Even my mother, who used to tuck me in with whispered lullabies, now couldn't hold my gaze. At one point during the meal I looked toward her, not with expectation, just out of habit, like reaching for a familiar shape in the dark. But she lowered her eyes, pretending to focus on folding her napkin. Her fingers moved slowly, unnecessarily, smoothing the fabric over and over like something delicate and breakable. She didn't smile. She didn't ask how I was. She hadn't said more than a strained hello when I arrived. Her silence wrapped around me like a second skin, suffocating and tight, a quiet confirmation that whatever warmth she once reserved for me had cooled long ago into something careful and distant. I had placed the gift, the one I'd spent months planning and weeks assembling, on the small side table near the Christmas tree, the one Bryce used to stack his video game controllers on when he was younger. It sat there quietly, wrapped in the same paper I had chosen so deliberately, the velvet ribbon still tied with a perfect knot. No one asked what it was or who it was for. No one even looked. When I set it down, Bryce had glanced up briefly from his phone, only long enough to determine that it didn't concern him, then immediately returned to whatever bright screen occupied his world. He didn't smile. He didn't say thank you. He didn't even blink in recognition. He used to run into my arms when he was little, used to beg me to tell him stories before bed, used to ask if I would take him to the museum or the zoo whenever I came to visit. Now he sat slouched at the table, barely present, entirely uninterested in anything beyond his screen. I wasn't a person to him anymore. Just a fixture. Another adult in the room. Another provider. And maybe that's all I was to them now. The one who paid for the Christmas dinner, quietly without asking for anything in return. The one who funded Zachary's startup without conditions. The one who booked the wine delivery, arranged the catering when Mom said she was too tired this year, made the down payment on the Airbnb Haley and Zachary used last summer for their anniversary trip. The one who remembered birthdays with quiet little deposits, who never missed a baby shower or a graduation gift, who said yes more times than she should have because it was easier than saying no and being called dramatic. But I was never invited in. Not truly. Not to the inner circle. Not to the parts where memories were made and opinions were heard and eyes were met with warmth. I wasn't seen as a sibling or a daughter or an aunt anymore. I was something else entirely. I was support. Infrastructure. The one who made things easier for everyone else to shine. The one who kept the lights on but never got to take the stage. My presence was welcome only insofar as it stayed quiet, convenient, and out of the way. Any attempt to step forward, to speak, to share, was met with the same reflexive dismissal. A polite smile at best, a brush off at worst. I had been holding on to this idea that if I did enough, gave enough, showed up enough, they would see me. That their respect was something I could earn like a promotion or a degree, if only I checked all the right boxes. But in that room, surrounded by people who called themselves family, I saw the truth settle over everything like a fine layer of dust. They didn't want to see me. Not really. They wanted what I gave. They wanted the ease of my presence, the convenience of my silence, the quiet reliability of someone who would always say, "Sure, I can take care of that." And I had played that role so well for so long, that I had forgotten it wasn't the same as being loved. It wasn't even the same as being wanted. It was a performance of belonging. A ghost standing among the living. A placeholder in a chair no one saved for me. It was barely spring when Zachary called me in the middle of the night, his voice tight and hoarse with anxiety, the kind that slips out only when pride has completely burned away. I had been asleep, my phone vibrating against the nightstand with that particular urgency I'd come to associate with family only when they needed something. I answered on the second ring, my heart already racing with half-formed thoughts of hospitals, arrests, or something far worse. But no, it was Zach, pacing in his apartment, I imagined, with his hands in his hair and the blinds drawn shut, explaining in clipped, hurried tones that he'd maxed out 2 credit cards trying to cover early development costs, that his launch date had been delayed, that a contractor had walked away with half a payment and no deliverables, and he needed $3,200 or he was going to default before the end of the week. I remember sitting on the edge of my bed, the blue light from the screen washing over my bare knees, listening to him list off the deadlines like a drowning man rattling off the weight of his chains. I didn't hesitate. I told him I'd send the money in the morning. He didn't say thank you. He just exhaled like someone who had been holding his breath underwater, then muttered, "Appreciate it," and hung up. By noon the next day the transfer was complete. No contracts. No terms. Just blood. Because that's what it felt like, family pulling at you not with gratitude but expectation, the way gravity pulls a body to earth. That wasn't the first time. Nor the last. Months before that, Bryce had been selected to travel with his high school basketball team for a regional tournament in Miami. Zachary called me from the car, the sound of wind rushing past the window as he talked like it was a done deal already, like I was simply the last logistical step between his son and Florida. "Tickets are $600, he said. "Can you get them today? We've got to confirm with the coach." I asked if he'd looked at flights himself. He hadn't. I asked if Haley could help. He deflected. I didn't even ask why I was the one footing the bill. I just opened my laptop, found the flight, entered my card details and sent him the confirmation code. When the boarding passes were printed, when Bryce walked through the gate at the airport with his duffel bag over one shoulder and that familiar adolescent shrug on his face, no one said anything. Not Zach. Not Haley. Not Bryce. Later I got a single text that read, "OI." 2 words. No heart emoji. No smile. Just black letters on a white screen. And even that felt more like a receipt than a thank you. And still I stayed present. When Zach pitched Nova Current Media to me, he was already spinning with the energy of a man who had convinced himself that success was inevitable. He came to my apartment wearing a blazer over a wrinkled t-shirt, holding a binder with printed slides and branding mock-ups like he was presenting at some Ivy League incubator. I poured coffee. I offered him biscotti I'd bought specifically for the meeting, trying to treat it with the same respect I would any other investor presentation. He paced while he talked, his voice rising and falling with the rhythm of salesmanship, describing digital content trends, niche audiences, monetization strategies, platform pivoting. He used phrases like scalable architecture and growth curve potential, like they were currency, spinning his dream into something airtight. And I listened. Carefully. I took notes. I asked pointed questions, not to challenge him but to understand where he was heading, to really see what he was trying to build. I read the business plan front to back. Twice. I consulted a friend who worked in early-stage funding, just to make sure I wasn't walking into a disaster. I believed in him even when the market didn't. I gave him my money, more than I should have, because I thought that was what family did. Because I thought I could be something other than an outsider if I proved myself valuable enough. But even then, even with the funds already wired and his vision given shape by my trust, he looked at me across the table with that half-smile he always wore when he was talking to someone he thought was beneath the conversation, and he said, "You know, I appreciate the support, Lena, but you don't really understand innovation." "I don't understand innovation." That's what he said to me. To the person who kept his business breathing when he couldn't get an investor meeting. To the person who funded his digital marketing team before the first line of code was written. To the person who saved him from insolvency not once but twice. I remember how that moment hollowed something out in me like carving a hole into softwood. Not because I didn't expect it. By then I had already begun to lower my expectations with every phone call. But because of how effortlessly he dismissed me. How he could look at me knowing full well what I'd given up, and still speak as if my place in the story was peripheral. It was the same tone he used at dinner when he spoke about his deals and his team and his product like he alone had conjured it out of nothing. Like success had come to him by merit, by talent, by sheer brilliance, rather than by the quiet sacrifices of someone he never bothered to acknowledge. And I knew, sitting there with my napkin folded in my lap, that this family saw me the same way he did. Not as a sister, not as a partner, not even as a person with insight or knowledge or value, but as a resource. A reservoir they could draw from, guilt-free, because I never asked for anything in return. Not even a thank you. It was July, the air thick with heat and the scent of grilled meat and sunscreen, the kind of day that clung to your skin and made everything feel slower, heavier. The whole family had gathered for the annual summer picnic at Maple Creek Park, spreading out under the wide oaks with folding chairs, paper plates, and those same red and white checkered tablecloths we'd been using since I was a teenager. Children chased one another around the splash pad, music played softly from a portable speaker someone had brought, and adults gathered in loose circles, some under the shade, others crowding near the food table, drinking beer and swapping old stories like worn cards passed from hand to hand. I had arrived early that morning to help set everything up. I carried 2 full coolers from my trunk, unloaded platters of fruit, pre-cut and arranged in neat rows, and unpacked the custom cupcakes I'd ordered with the family's initials iced in pastel letters. No one asked me to do it, of course. They never did. But I'd done it anyway, out of habit, out of hope, out of that same quiet need that had always followed me like a second heartbeat. The hope that this time they would see, that this time they would say something that sounded like gratitude. It was mid-afternoon when Zachary stood near the grill, beer in hand, his t-shirt damp with sweat along the collar. A group had gathered around him. Dad, Rachel, a couple of our cousins, even Mom seated in a low chair with a wide-brimmed sun hat pulled low over her forehead. Someone had just asked about his startup, about how he'd managed to survive the first turbulent year, and Zachary, never one to downplay his own mythology, launched into a story about bootstrapping, risks, sacrifices, sleepless nights. I stood nearby, quietly refilling drinks, listening without inserting myself. I always listened. It was the only way I knew how to stay tethered to them, by hovering at the edges of their conversations, nodding at the right times, smiling even when I felt myself shrinking. Then, as the story crescendoed, Zachary laughed, tossing his head back slightly before gesturing toward me with his beer can and saying, in that same easy, joking voice he always used when he wanted to cut someone down without sounding cruel, "Honestly, Lena's just our family's aim. Come on, she's got nothing else going on, just work and bank transfers." Everyone laughed. Not just a polite chuckle, not the kind of uncomfortable smile people give when they're unsure. It was a real laugh. A chorus of amusement. The kind that rolls through a crowd like wind through dry grass, catching on every face, every open mouth. Even Mom smiled, tight-lipped but still unmistakable, and Rachel nudged the cousin next to her like it was the funniest thing Zach had said all day. I stood there holding a sweating bottle of sparkling water in one hand, and I felt the warmth drain from my face. Not from embarrassment, I'd moved past that long ago, but from a slow seeping shame that reached somewhere old and soft inside me, a place I rarely allowed myself to acknowledge. Because the worst part wasn't what he said. It wasn't even the laughter. It was the fact that I didn't say a word. I didn't defend myself. I didn't laugh it off or speak up or call it what it was. Cruel, lazy, dismissive. I just stood there. Like I always did. Silent. Small. Following it whole. And the moment passed like they always do. The conversation shifted. Someone brought over another round of drinks, and Zachary moved on to his next anecdote like the words had never left his mouth. But they had. And they stayed with me. They attached themselves to all the other quiet humiliations I'd collected over the years. The jokes, the jabs, the silences, the missed invitations, the expectations that I would always be available, always be generous, always be quiet. I kept setting out food. I kept pouring drinks. I kept pretending that my worth didn't hinge on their ability to see me as more than what I gave. But later, when I was sitting alone at the picnic table while the others played a lazy game of frisbee on the lawn, I couldn't stop hearing it. "Lena's just our A-team. She's got nothing else going on." Said like a punchline. Said like truth. Said like it had always been that way. And the most painful part was that, in their eyes, it had. Because I had let it. Because I had given and given and given without ever asking them to see me as more. Because I had believed, so foolishly, that love could be earned through usefulness. And now I was just the machine. Quiet. Reliable. Forgettable. Zachary stood up slowly, his wine glass held aloft, the room falling gradually into a hush as people turned their attention to him with the kind of readiness reserved for someone they were used to applauding. The lights above the dining table shimmered against the gold rim of his glass, and his voice, always confident, always perfectly pitched for moments like these, cut through the room with practiced ease. He smiled, glanced around at the faces turned toward him, and began speaking with that tone of humble pride he wore like a tailored suit. "Before dessert," he said, "I just want to take a moment to say thank you. This year has been insane, in the best way, and I wouldn't have made it through without some really special people." I was sitting 2 chairs down from the center of the table, a little outside the glow of the chandelier, the flicker of candlelight barely touching the edge of my plate. I straightened slightly in my chair without meaning to, my hands folded loosely in my lap, my heart already beginning to move toward him like it always did in these moments. I thought maybe this is it. Maybe finally. "Haley," he said, turning toward her, his voice softening as if his love for her was too big to be contained. You've been my rock. Through the sleepless nights, the stress, the constant phone calls, you never once told me to shut up. Not once. Thank you for believing in me. Haley laughed, gently touching his arm, and the room echoed with polite smiles, approving murmurs. My mother dabbed at the corner of her eye, whether from pride or the wine I wasn't sure. Bryce, Zach continued, raising his glass slightly in his son's direction, watching you grow up, seeing your discipline, your drive on the court, that pushes me every single day. You remind me why I'm doing this. Bryce looked up for the first time in nearly an hour, gave a small nod and then glanced back down at his phone, but the message had landed. More smiles, more affirmations. Rachel clapped her hands lightly against her glass, nodding as if everything he said was poetry. And Aunt Darlene, he said next, turning to our father's sister who had said maybe 3 words all evening, you always told me I'd make something of myself. That meant a lot. It really did. Laughter now. Louder. Warmer. The room expanding around him, people leaning in, eyes glinting in the candlelight. He paused for effect, letting the moment stretch, and then came the announcement. And I'm proud to say Nova Current Media just closed its first major round of funding. $500,000. We're officially on the map. The room erupted. There was clapping, gasps, people rising halfway out of their chairs. Someone at the far end actually whistled. Haley let out a joyful little shriek and hugged him tightly, and my mother clapped both hands together and said, "Oh, Zachary," like he had just come home from war. But I didn't move. I couldn't. I sat perfectly still, my breath held just behind my teeth, watching the way he soaked in the admiration, how naturally he accepted it, how seamlessly he folded the praise into himself like a man who had never once doubted he deserved it. He didn't look at me. Not once. My name didn't cross his lips. He stood there, shining under the lights, being celebrated for work that had been paid for by my hands, by my quiet sacrifices, by months of budget rearranging, late-night anxiety spirals, and the kind of trust you don't write into contracts because you assume, stupidly, blindly, that family honors what papers never could. It was my money. The funding he announced, the number that had everyone applauding, had come from me. Every cent. Not an investor from Silicon Valley, not a seed firm out of Austin, not some angel investor with a vague last name and a LinkedIn profile full of buzzwords. Me. I was the one who had read his pitch deck at midnight, who edited his copy before he even sent it out, who pulled together those first funds when every door had closed in his face and no one else would bet on him. I had done it because I believed in him. Because I thought belief was something that would be remembered. But it wasn't. I watched his face, how alive it looked, flushed with pride and attention. I watched the way Haley leaned into him, already talking about media exposure, press releases. I saw Bryce scroll through his phone, maybe already posting about his father's success. I saw my mother smile, the same proud mother smile she used to save for Christmas concerts and graduation speeches. I watched all of it unfold like a play I had no role in. No one turned to me. No one asked. No one questioned where that money had come from. They didn't want to know. The narrative was too clean. Zachary had done it. And my part, whatever it was, didn't fit their version of the story. I felt my jaw tighten, the sting of something too deep for words pressing against the back of my throat. But I didn't cry. I didn't speak. I didn't even blink. I sat there, tasting copper at the edge of my tongue, and wondered how many more times I would have to watch him be celebrated for what I had made possible. How many more meals I would attend like this, how many more toasts I would listen to, each one a carefully wrapped box of erasure. He raised his glass again, nodded once more to the table and said, "To all of you. You've kept me going." And I drank. Quietly. Alone. To no one. The card was tucked neatly between the silverware, the same as all the others, ivory cardstock, the edges slightly embossed, the name written in flowing gold script, carefully placed on the linen napkin folded into a perfect triangle. It should have been a small gesture, a sign that someone had thought about me when setting the table, that I wasn't an afterthought. But when I looked down and saw the name written there, the breath caught in my chest. Lena Jackson. Not Porter. Jackson. The name I hadn't used in 11 years. The name that belonged to a life I had buried, quietly and thoroughly, with the kind of private resolve you don't explain to people who never ask. That name had stayed on a mortgage document too long, lingered on insurance forms I kept forgetting to update, but I had long since reclaimed myself in every way that mattered. I had gone to court. I had signed the forms. I had taken back my name, my own name, not because I was angry or bitter or needed to make some kind of statement, but because that chapter was over. It had ended. Finally. Everyone at that table knew it. I stared at the card for a long moment, my fingers resting gently on the edge of the plate, feeling the blood rush to my face. For a second I thought maybe it was a mistake made by someone else. Perhaps Haley had ordered the cards and didn't know. But she did. We'd spoken about it before. I had signed emails, texts, even birthday cards with Porter. There was no confusion. And then I saw Zachary's smile. He was already watching me, amusement flickering behind his eyes like he was waiting to see if I'd react. When I looked up at him, the card still sitting untouched in front of me, he gave a short, lazy shrug, lifting his wine glass slightly in a mock toast and said, "What does it matter? Just a mistake." Haley, seated beside him in a new silk blouse, let out a small giggle, the kind of thoughtless, effortless sound people make when they don't realize, or don't care, how cruel they're being. Her bracelet clinked softly against her glass as she leaned in closer to him, clearly entertained. No one else said anything. Not Rachel, who was busy adjusting her napkin. Not my mother, who looked down at her plate as if it had suddenly become fascinating. Not Dad, who didn't even lift his eyes. No one corrected him. No one defended me. No one even pretended it was inappropriate. I reached forward and turned the card over slowly, face down, the way you cover something that burns your skin. My hands were steady, but inside something fractured just a little further. A quiet, sharp crack that no one in the room would hear but that I would carry with me long after dessert was served. It wasn't about the name. Not really. It was about what it represented. The sheer thoughtlessness. The laziness of not caring enough to check. The implication that my life, my choices, my identity, were so irrelevant to them that they couldn't even get my name right at a table I had helped pay for, surrounded by people I had shown up for time and time again. It was a dismissal wrapped in paper and calligraphy, an insult softened only by the fact that no one thought it mattered enough to hide. They saw me through a lens frozen in time. A version of me from over a decade ago. A version defined by someone else's last name, someone who hadn't spoken to me in years, someone they never even liked. But that was how they chose to label me now. Publicly at the table among wine and laughter and polished glassware. It was as if everything I had built, every moment I had fought to stand on my own, was invisible. Zachary had made the joke deliberately. I saw it in the curve of his mouth, the casual cruelty of someone who knew he wouldn't be challenged. He'd always had a gift for knowing exactly how far he could go without anyone stepping in. And he'd gone just far enough. I wanted to speak, to correct him, to say, "It's Porter. It's been Porter for years." I wanted to say it not just for the sake of the name but for everything it represented, my independence, my work, my choice to live on my own terms. But the words sat like stones in my mouth. Because I knew that even if I said them, even if I claimed that small piece of truth out loud, the room would remain the same. Zachary would still smile. Haley would still laugh. And everyone else would still stay silent. So I didn't say anything. I sat there, surrounded by the clatter of forks, the murmur of conversations I wasn't part of, and the faint sound of holiday music playing from the other room. I breathed slowly, evenly, pressing my hands flat against my thighs beneath the table. I looked down at the name again, face down now, hidden like something shameful, and thought about how easy it was to disappear in a family that had already decided who you were. And how hard it was to keep showing up anyway. Somewhere between the end of the second course and the beginning of dessert, when the lights had dimmed just slightly and the room was heavy with the scent of baked apples and spiced cream, I noticed it. The package. The one I had spent months preparing, wrapping with such care it felt like an extension of my own hands, was no longer resting beneath the tree where I had placed it when I arrived. My chest tightened as my eyes moved across the room, scanning the corners, searching for it in the shadows of gift bags and discarded coats. And then I saw it. Half buried under a crumpled linen napkin, with a wine glass placed directly over its corner as if someone had needed to make space and simply shoved it aside. There it was. Still unopened. Still untouched. The velvet ribbon I had tied so precisely was slightly bent now, crushed beneath the weight of glass and the unspoken message that it didn't matter. No one had asked whose it was. No one had wondered what was inside. They had simply cleared space on the buffet, wiping the counters of their gratitude and stacking their praise on Zachary's shoulders without hesitation. And now my gift, my offering, my one quiet attempt to be seen, was nothing more than an obstacle between someone's elbow and a second helping of dessert. I knew what was inside. I could still see it in my mind. The investor contract printed on heavy paper stock, its corners razor sharp, the ink a deep navy blue, elegant, final. It was the official agreement, the confirmation that I had funded Nova Current Media's entire launch round. My signature was there. My bank's authorization was there. I had placed it inside a leather folder, wrapped it in layers of tissue and sealed it in that box because I believed like a fool that revealing it at the right time, at Christmas surrounded by family during the season of generosity, would finally shift something in the way they saw me. But they hadn't even opened it. Not even out of curiosity. Not even to mock it. It had simply been ignored. And that's when it happened, Not loud, not dramatic, not like the breaking of a plate or the slamming of a door. It was quiet. Almost imperceptible. Just a slow, exacting awareness curling in the center of my chest like cold smoke. They didn't see me. Not truly. Not as I was. Not as the person who held their celebrations together, who sent money when things broke, who designed the seating plan and arranged the catering and paid the invoice for the wine shipment when Mom said it was too much this year. They loved the party. They praised the atmosphere, complimented the lighting, admired the food and the playlist and the decorations, but in their eyes, it all belonged to Zachary. Because he stood in the center. Because he was the one who raised his glass and told the story. No one questioned who made it possible. No one looked behind the curtain. No one asked what was in the box. To them it wasn't a gift. It was just another silent thing I had done. Another invisible gesture, absorbed into the texture of their comfort. Just like everything else I had given. And sitting there with the laughter rising again around me, with Zachary's voice already launching into another retelling of the pitch meeting that landed him his mythical, outside investment, I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to say aloud until now. I wasn't just ignored. I was erased. What I gave didn't add value. It simply filled space. What I offered wasn't admired. It was expected. I wasn't a guest at this table. I was the one who set it, paid for it, polished every surface of it, and then was asked to bring my own chair when they forgot I existed. My name wasn't in the toast. My name wasn't on the place card. My name wasn't on their lips even when my signature was on their future. I sat there, the noise of the room drifting around me like static, and stared at that forgotten box with the contract inside. My heart didn't race. My face didn't flush. There was no sudden wave of grief or rage. Just a flat, still quiet. Like the sound of snow falling outside a window no one bothers to look through. They didn't see me. They never had. And something in me at last stopped reaching for them. I stood up slowly, my chair scraping quietly against the floor, the sound barely audible beneath the steady hum of conversation and clinking glasses. My hands moved on their own, not shaking, not uncertain, just steady with a weight I had carried too long. I walked toward the side table where my gift had been pushed aside, now half hidden beneath someone's napkin and the empty base of a wineglass, as though it had never mattered. The room didn't seem to notice at first. They were still laughing at something Zachary had said, the kind of laughter that wraps itself around people who have always felt too sure of their place in the world. I picked up the box, removed the ribbon and opened it carefully, my fingers brushing across the envelope containing the contract. I had printed it on heavy paper, something substantial, something impossible to mistake for anything less than real, and placed it inside with the quiet hope that someone, anyone, might care enough to open it themselves. But they hadn't. So I walked to the center of the room, box in hand, and stood at the edge of the table directly across from Zachary. My voice was calm when I spoke, quieter than I expected, but clear. This, I said, holding up the envelope, is a contract. A real one. The room began to quiet, heads turning slowly, forks pausing mid-air, glasses set back down on the table. I invested $450,000 into Nova Current Media, I continued. The company Zachary just announced received $500,000 in funding. That funding came from me. The silence that followed wasn't the kind that asks for more. It wasn't anticipation. It was discomfort. A shuffling of pride and confusion and something else they couldn't name yet. No one clapped this time. No one cheered. The only sound was the faint hiss of the fireplace and the breath catching in someone's throat. I didn't care who. Zachary blinked first. He gave a small, forced laugh, the kind of laugh that's meant to deflect, to break the tension with performance. Come on, he said, smiling as though I just made a joke at my own expense. Lena's always been generous, but let's not turn this into Dragon's Den, yeah? His voice wavered just enough for me to hear the panic behind the charm. But he didn't look at me directly. He looked at the others, searching their faces for affirmation, trying to laugh them back into comfort, into forgetting. Like he always did. And then Renee chimed in from her seat near the end of the table, where she sat picking at her untouched dessert with a gold fork. Seriously, she said, her voice light, amused, dripping with the kind of disbelief reserved for someone you've never bothered to understand. What are you now, a venture capitalist? The laughter that followed hers was thin. But she smiled anyway, the kind of smile that knows it's safe in a room where no one is ever held accountable. I didn't answer her. I didn't flinch. I didn't give any of them the explanation they suddenly wanted now that the truth was uncomfortable and not convenient. I simply looked down at the envelope still resting in my hand, nodded once and turned toward the door. I didn't slam it. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I walked through the hallway quietly, past the coat rack, past the framed photographs of us as children, smiling under trees and around campfires. Photographs that felt like a lie now. I opened the front door, the cold air meeting my face like a slap. I welcomed and stepped outside. The snow had started again, soft and clean and indifferent. It gathered on the railing, on the steps, on the hood of my car. I stood there for a moment, letting the silence wrap around me in a way the warmth inside never had. My breath rose in slow, visible clouds. The night stretched out wide and silent, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was waiting for someone to come after me. The cold air stung my cheeks as I stepped into the yard, the wind sharp with the bite of winter, but it felt cleaner out here, honest in a way that nothing inside had been. The sky above was heavy with clouds, diffusing the moonlight into a dull silver haze. Beneath it, the snow lay undisturbed, muffling the world in a kind of silence that made every movement deliberate, every breath purposeful. In the far corner of the yard, the stone fire pit still glowed faintly from earlier, the embers a soft red beneath a pile of charred wood. Someone had tossed in pine cones for the smell, and the scent still lingered, sharp and resinous in the crisp air. I walked toward it slowly, the box still in my hands, and knelt beside the fire. The ground was damp through my tights, but I didn't care. I opened the lid one final time and took out the contract. The pages felt heavier now, heavier than paper should be, weighted not by ink but by everything they had once meant to me. I unfolded them carefully, smoothing out the creases where I had pressed them flat before wrapping them. Each line, each signature had once represented hope. A quiet, stubborn hope that I could make something meaningful not just for Zachary but for myself. That I could be more than the one in the background. That I could build something with my hands and have it recognized for what it was. But now I saw it for what it had become, proof of my own erasure. I struck a match and held it under the corner of the first page. For a moment the flame hesitated, licking at the edge before catching with a quiet hiss. The fire bloomed upward quickly, orange and alive, curling the paper inward as the ink darkened, twisted, vanished. I held it until it was too hot, then dropped it gently into the fire pit, watching the pages collapse in on themselves, blackening, shrinking into ash. The heat pulsed against my face, bright and sudden, and the wind caught the smoke, carrying it upward and away from me. It didn't feel dramatic. It didn't feel vengeful. It felt right. I took out my phone with hands that no longer trembled and opened my email app. The draft was already there. I had written it weeks ago, late one night after another call from Zachary asking for just one more bridge amount to get through the next month. I hadn't sent it then. I told myself it wasn't time yet, that he still deserved the benefit of the doubt. But now there was nothing left to protect. Subject: withdrawal of funding, Nova Current Media. I added one line to the body. Effective immediately, I am rescinding my financial support and terminating our agreement as outlined in Clause 9C. Then I signed my name. My real name. Lena Porter. I pressed send. The reply came faster than I expected. Less than 30 minutes later, as I stood there with the fire dying beside me and snow beginning to gather on my shoulders, my phone buzzed once. From Capital Ridge Ventures. Confirmed. Per your instruction, all funding is withdrawn. Contract terminated. No further obligations. That was it. Plain. Final. Clean. I slipped the phone into my coat pocket and looked back toward the house. Through the frosted windows, the room still pulsed with warm light. They were laughing again. Haley was leaning across the table to show someone a photo on her phone. My mother was sipping wine with that distant smile. Zachary was holding court, probably retelling the story of his victory. Nothing had changed for them. They were still locked in their own little world, one where I didn't matter beyond what I could provide. But I was no longer part of it. Not in the way I had been. Not in the way they had grown to expect. I stood there for a long moment watching them from the cold, watching them in that capsule of comfort and delusion, and I felt the sharp finality of it settle deep in my chest. Not as grief but as clarity. This was the end. Not of me. Of us. The call came early the next morning, just after 8, when the light outside was still dim and the sky hung low with that gray winter heaviness that makes time feel slower. My phone lit up on the nightstand, and before I even picked it up, I knew it would be him. I didn't answer at first. I just watched the screen blink with his name, Zachary, until it went dark again. Then it lit up once more. And again. 3 times in 5 minutes. When I finally answered, his voice came through strained and uneven, tight with panic and raw from what I guessed had been a night without sleep. It didn't sound like the voice of the man who had raised a glass in a room full of people and accepted praise for something he hadn't built. It didn't sound like the brother who had laughed when I was diminished in front of everyone. It sounded like a man watching something unravel in real time, thread by thread. Lena. He started, not even bothering with hello. Please. Just listen. We're in a crisis. Capital Ridge pulled everything, and when that happened, the second round of investors walked. Our suppliers already froze shipments, and the hosting service is threatening to shut the site down. His words came fast, tangled together as though if he said them quickly enough, they might not mean what they clearly did. It's not too late, he continued. We can fix this. I just need you to step in again just until things stabilize. Please, Lena. Just a few weeks. I swear we'll restructure the deal. I'll sign anything. I'll put your name on everything this time. He said please 3 more times. But none of the words landed. Because everything that had needed to be said had already been said. On the night he left my name out of the toast, when he called me a machine, when he laughed off my identity, when he let them erase me without hesitation. This desperation wasn't about recognizing my worth. It wasn't an apology. It was about losing what I gave. I closed my eyes for a moment, not to escape him but to hear myself more clearly. And then I said without hesitation, you made your choice. I made mine. There was a silence on the other end, just long enough to feel the collapse settling in. And I hung up. No explanation. No softness. No guilt. I set the phone down gently, stood up and walked to the window. Outside, the world was quiet, blanketed in fresh snow, undisturbed. I watched the white light fill the room slowly, clean and cold. Behind me, my phone remained still. He didn't call again. It didn't happen all at once. There was no cinematic moment of triumph, no dramatic shedding of the past. It was quieter than that, slow, steady, deliberate. Like healing. Like waking up one day and realizing the air felt lighter, that the weight you'd been carrying for years had quietly slipped off your shoulders in the night. I started with the decision to give, not to those who demanded it, expected it or took it for granted, but to those who had never been given a chance. I donated $300,000 to establish a scholarship fund for women entering the tech field, especially those from underserved communities, women like I had once been, talented, curious, underestimated. I called it the Lena Porter Tech Scholarship. Not because I needed my name on something. I wasn't trying to be remembered. I was finally trying to matter. It was the first time I'd put my name on anything without flinching. Creating that fund felt different from all the times I had given money before. This wasn't a reaction to someone else's crisis. It wasn't a bandage or a peace offering. It was a beginning. The application process opened 3 weeks later. I read every submission myself. Not because I had to, but because I wanted to see who they were. These women who dreamed of building something, of writing their own code, their own stories, their own futures. Each essay felt like a mirror held to the version of myself that had never been allowed to bloom. Around the same time, I enrolled in a coding bootcamp. A full-stack program, intensive and immersive, 5 days a week. I was older than most of the students, surrounded by fresh graduates and women shifting careers in their 20s, but I didn't care. I sat in the front row every day, took notes like my life depended on it, and found a thrill in solving problems that no one else had handed to me. I pushed through imposter syndrome, through the long nights debugging, through the quiet fear that I had waited too long. And then one day I wrote a piece of code that worked. Clean. Elegant. I joined a Women in Tech community not long after, a local chapter that met weekly in a shared workspace downtown. The first time I walked in, I didn't introduce myself as Zachary's sister. I didn't mention the startup. I didn't explain my past or what I had walked away from. I just said, "Hi, I'm Lena. I'm learning full stack and I'm interested in accessibility tech." And someone replied, "Great. Come sit." No one asked for anything. No one expected me to fund their projects, to fix their problems, to earn my seat by holding their weight. I belonged because I showed up. I stayed because I wanted to. For the first time, I began to understand what agency felt like. Not just the absence of control from others, but the quiet presence of choice. Of living a day that was mine, shaped by my own hands, not by someone else's needs or demands. I found joy in small things again. In morning walks without a phone buzzing with requests. In writing code for apps that helped people with visual impairments. In coffee dates with women who had built themselves from nothing and weren't interested in hierarchy, only community. I wasn't trying to prove myself anymore. I wasn't trying to be the one they finally thanked. I wasn't waiting to be seen. I was living. On my terms. Not for them. For me. The messages started coming in 2 days later, once the dust had truly settled, once the reality of what had happened began to sink in. Not just for them but for me as well. I listened to Haley's voice trembling in a voicemail she had clearly rehearsed at least once before hitting record. She said she was sorry if I felt hurt, sorry if things had gotten blown out of proportion. Her voice wavered in a way that was meant to sound sincere, but still cushioned in that careful, soft blame that avoids real ownership. She mentioned the holidays, how stressful everything had been, how no one had intended for things to come out the way they did. She never once said, "We failed you." She said, "It got out of hand." As if I had been a fire, not a person. I didn't call her back. Then came Renee. Not a call, not a voicemail. Just a single-line text message delivered with the same flat energy she had always carried, that self-satisfied dismissiveness she wore like perfume. You're overreacting. This is family. You don't just walk away because you didn't get a thank you. That was all she wrote. Not even punctuation. And I realized in that moment, reading those words under the sterile glow of my phone screen, that to some people, love was always going to look like tolerance and accountability was always going to feel like betrayal. Renee didn't see me. Not then, not ever. He saw a disturbance. A variable in the family dynamic she didn't want to recalibrate. And like all the others, she assumed I would come back. That I always came back. But I didn't reply. Bryce didn't say anything at all. No message. No acknowledgement. Not even a quiet apology buried in emojis or half-formed sentences. Silence, it turned out, could be just as clear as words. And his silence told me everything I already suspected. He had grown up learning that my value was conditional, transactional, something that existed in the background of his comfort. And when that disappeared, he didn't reach for me. He didn't even look. Only Elliot reached out. My cousin, technically second cousin twice removed, but the only one who ever made me feel like I belonged in the room. His message came late at night and it was simple. Hey, I just want to know how you're doing. No agenda. Just thinking about you. That was it. No lecture. No guilt. No list of what I should have done differently. Just care. Just presence. And I responded. Because he asked like a person. Because he never needed me to prove anything. But even then I didn't go back. Not to them. Not to that house or those dinners, or the rituals that had asked me for everything and offered nothing in return. In my new life I had found something they had never given me and maybe never could, respect. Not the kind you demand with volume or obligation, but the quiet kind that comes from people who see you fully and still choose to meet you there. The women I studied code with. The colleagues I brainstormed projects with. The scholarship recipients who sent me notes full of grit and gratitude. They weren't bound to me by blood or family history. But they showed up. They asked questions. They listened. And they never once looked at me like I was an afterthought. I had spent so many years twisting myself into versions that might be easier for my family to accept. Quieter, more generous, more invisible. But in stepping away I had finally stepped into myself. I no longer needed to be needed. I no longer mistook usefulness for love. I had walked out of that house into the snow with nothing but my name and the truth. And I never looked back. Because I had already arrived.